All right, so welcome back to another midweek with Double Creek. Right now we are in week 36 out of our 52 weeks with Jesus from the book by James Merritt. We're still in the sixth week of the fifth section of this book. This section is called Jesus the Teacher. So far we've looked at some very interesting teachings already from Jesus. We started this section off by looking at how we should judge as Christians, taught by Jesus. The next 3 weeks, we spent 3 weeks then looking at how we should pray when Jesus taught the disciples how to pray. Last week, we looked at the subject of how to handle money and finances. Today, we get another tough teaching here by Jesus. If you've ever felt like this section is tough to listen to, just imagine what it would have been like for those people that Jesus was actually talking to in the crowd during those days. Because he was teaching, he was speaking straight to many of those who were in attendance and watching about these subjects. Well, today, what he says still speaks to us as well. These teachings by Jesus, they apply just as much to us today as they did to the people he was talking to during those days when he taught. So far, all of the teachings in those first 5 weeks of this section that we have looked at from Jesus have come from what we call the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. But today we are going to look at one of the teachings of Jesus that comes from another section in Matthew. The title of today's lesson is called A Marriage Counselor, and it comes from the section of Matthew chapter 19, verses 1 through 6. I'll read those verses here in a bit. This subject, the subject of marriage, is tough for a lot of different people for many different reasons. When it comes to marriage, marriage can be tough. It can be difficult when God is not at the center of it. I read recently that as of last month, the United States has the 6th highest divorce rate in the world, with 40 to 50% of married couples filing for a divorce. I also read that the second and third marriages have a higher divorce rate than people who have only been married one time. Apparently, a man named Glenn Wolfe is known for having the largest number of marriages. Have any idea how many times Wolfe was married? Wolfe was married 31 times. Now, 3 of those were married to people he had previously divorced. So he was married to 28 different women, but he went through 31 different wedding ceremonies. You have any idea what Wolfe's profession was? Well, apparently Wolfe was an American Baptist minister. One of his marriages lasted a grand total of 19 days. Marriage can be tough for a lot of people. No wonder Paul had these words to say about marriage in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. He said, "I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another." And so when Paul is saying there that he wished all were as he was himself, he's talking about not being married. Because Paul, he understood just how difficult marriage can be. Marriage is tough for a lot of people, but that's always been the case. So let's see what Jesus had to say here today in our topic on marriage from Matthew chapter 19, the first 6 verses. Jesus says, "Now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, 'Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?' He answered, 'Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate.'" Marriage and divorce. In our world, it's like they just go hand in hand, isn't it? Have you ever seen someone get married and in the back of your mind you just feel like they should not be doing this? They're not going to make it. Now, those feelings, they typically are there because you are very familiar with both the man and the woman who are getting married. It's just commonplace in America that if you don't agree, if you argue, if you can't get along, to get a lawyer and file for divorce. So let's break down a little bit of what Jesus said here in this section. Merritt begins this chapter by talking about a blessed invention. If I ask you, what do you think the greatest inventions of all time are? What would you think might be in the top 10? You know, the list could change easily depending on who you ask and what they feel is most important. But one article listed the top 10 in this order: the wheel, the printing press, the plow, cement, the steam engine, penicillin, the light bulb, the lens, paper, and vaccines. Now, as I said, that list could change depending on who it is you're asking, who's making the list. You could have things like the telephone, automobiles, the airplane. The list could go on and on depending on who you ask. But Merritt talks about an invention, one that is not on this list, that didn't make this list. In his opinion, the one that has had the most influence, more than any of the other products there ever invented. And this one he's talking about isn't a product, it's a relationship. The greatest invention, according to Merritt, was established at the beginning of time, and it is marriage. You see, when marriage is practiced, when marriage is done the way that God intended for marriage to be done, it brings more good, blesses more cultures, brings more to society than any of those other inventions. The key is, though, when marriage is done the way God intended it to be done. But we, as human beings, we do what I've stated here many times, Wednesday nights and Sundays. We make a mess of God's perfect and great work. And it's been that way. It's been that way ever since the garden with Adam and Eve, once they brought sin into the world. Merritt also talks in this chapter about an article from Time magazine titled, "Why Marriage Matters." And it talked about the breakdown of the American family over the last 40 years. In this article it said, "How much does marriage matter? More than words can say. There is no single force causing as much measurable hardship and human misery in the country as the collapse of marriage." Now that's the opinion of one person, the one who wrote the article, but the opinion that really matters is the opinion of the one who invented marriage. Even though Jesus was never married, he knew more about marriage than any person who had ever lived, because he invented it. And in those few sentences that I just read that Jesus gave us, he gives us some great insight into what marriage really should be. So let's look at God's default position. In this section, who is it that comes along asking Jesus another question? We've seen it often in our Midweek series, but it was those Pharisees. And they weren't coming and asking a question from Jesus to get advice on a certain topic. As it said in the text, they were coming there to test Jesus. They were constantly testing Jesus, trying to trap him, find him saying something that went against the law that God had given to Moses for the nation of Israel to follow some 1,500 years earlier. And they basically were asking Jesus, could it ever be lawful, ever, for a man to just divorce his wife for whatever reason? For no cause, for any cause. In our country, divorce can take place for any reason, for no reason at all. If you just want to be out of a marriage, you can file for divorce. It might take some time, it might get ugly, but divorce can be done in America with no reason. Do you have any idea Do you know which state was the first in America to have a divorce? I read that the first divorce in America was on January the 5th of 1643. The divorce was granted by the Quarter Court of Boston, Massachusetts, on the ground that a man named Dennis Clark abandoned his wife to be with another woman. Any idea which state was the first to allow a no-fault divorce? Meaning that you could get a divorce with for no reason at all, just because you wanted to get a divorce. The first state to allow this was California in 1970. As of 2019, in our world now, all 50 states have allowed no-fault grounds for divorce. Merritt talks about how in the first century, though, there were two prominent rabbis in the first century with two different thoughts when it came to marriage. One was very liberal in his thinking. The other rabbi was very conservative in his thinking. The one who was very liberal, his thinking was this. His view is that if your wife burned the biscuits, you could get a divorce. His view is that if your wife had too many wrinkles, you could get a divorce. Basically, his view is if your wife looked bad or cooked bad, you could get a divorce from your wife. The other rabbi, who was much more conservative, limited divorce to only cases where some type of sexual sin had taken place. But what does Jesus say here? Well, instead of even answering their question, because he doesn't answer their question, instead of answering their question of how can we get out of a marriage, Jesus instead answered the question in this way, by stating why you should stay in a marriage. Jesus is making it clear to them that in this section that, listen, you're asking the wrong questions. And I think we do that. Do we ask the wrong questions sometimes? In our world, I think we can ask, do we spend more time looking for reasons to get out of a marriage than we do trying to stay in a marriage? Well, Jesus goes on to give the right answer to the right question when he said these words that I read earlier. Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. And Jesus was quoting a verse here when he says some of these words. He's quoting part of this from Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, where it says, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. This was said just after God, in Genesis 2, this was said just after God had created woman from the man. And here is God's default position on marriage, that a man shall leave his father and his mother, that the woman shall leave her father and mother, and they are joined in marriage and they become one. Too often, the becoming one never takes place in a marriage. See, we have to understand God's plan for marriage. Now, when you go back to Matthew 19, the them that Jesus refers to, the ones God created, are the first married couples in all of history, Adam and Eve. And notice how God created them. The Bible tells us also that God created them in his image. But in Genesis 5:2, we also read this. Male and female he created them. And he blessed them and named them man when they were created. From the very beginning, God built several qualities into what makes a marriage a real marriage. And Merritt makes some good points here. He points out that God designed duality. What he meant by that is it takes two to get married. That's pretty clear and obvious. But God created them. He didn't create just him or just her. The second characteristic Merritt talks about is heterosexuality. God did not create them male and male or female and female. God created them male and female. Maybe you've heard people say, God didn't create Adam and Steve, he created Adam and Eve. God purposely created them male and female. See, the only picture we ever get of marriage from God, the one who invented marriage, the only picture we ever get includes a man and a woman. And no matter what our society tells us, when people are born, they are either a male or a female. The third characteristic Merrick points out is monogamy. He did not create a male and females or a female and males. He created one man, one woman, and they became one through marriage. That's God's plan for marriage. And it's the only kind of marriage ceremony that I will perform, because to me it's the only true ceremony that is marriage. Any other marriage out there outside of God's plan, the one who invented marriage, to me isn't even a real marriage, no matter what our government says. God instituted marriage, not a government. It's God's plan. So remember God's purpose for marriage. God's purpose for marriage is not just to procreate. If you think about it, there are many couples out there who are Christian and just as married who cannot have a baby. So think about the words Jesus said in Matthew 19 and verse 5. Again, these words are quoted from Genesis, but Jesus said, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." So understand this. For a marriage to happen, a real marriage the way God intended it to be, a young boy and a young girl will grow up. They will leave their fathers and their mothers. You see, in a family, the main relationship is not between a child and a parent. That's a very important relationship, but it's not the main relationship. The main relationship is between a husband and a wife. That's what keeps a family together. And in America today, there are too many homes where single parents are trying to parent. It makes it extremely difficult on the single parent, but it also makes it extremely difficult on children sometimes. Now, in these words right here by Jesus, he gives some specific words to the man. Jesus said, "The man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife." The man is specifically told, hold fast to your wife. And the two, in God's eyes, will become one. See, when God sees a parent and a child, he sees two. When God sees a brother and a sister or two siblings, he sees two. But when God sees a husband and a wife, he needs to see one. And that sets the stage for the answer that Jesus continues to give to these Pharisees. What we must do is commit to God's permanence for marriage. So the words that you often hear at the end of a wedding where the man says, before he says, "I pronounce you man and wife," a man says in a ceremony, it's usually the words of the preacher, Jesus concluded his command to the Pharisees in the same way. "What therefore God has joined together," he said, "let not man separate." The phrase "joined together" there means to be glued together. Now, there are all types of glue out there. There's Elmer's glue, there's Gorilla Glue, there's super glue. There's some cheap glue that doesn't hardly hold anything together. But this joint here together is something that is meant to not be broken. It is binding. So, do you ever feel like you are stuck with a person that you are married to? Well, in God's eyes, you are. Because according to his permanence for marriage, you're there, glued together. Throughout all of this, I think we have to understand that marriage is not what culture brings together. It's not what a government makes happen. Marriage is brought together by God. And so if we force something, if we try to make something happen without it being God's will for us, then most likely it's going to come back and bite us. So as we finish, maybe the problem is that we think too much like Pharisees in our world. Not just with marriage, but with other things, but especially with marriage. We focus a lot on what we can't do. But our focus should be on what we can and what we should be doing as Christians. The key to marriage, I think, is that God is involved in it. God intends for it to last forever. And when God is at the center of a marriage, it will last. I have no doubts about that. The good news is that when two become one, and as the two look to the one who invented marriage, then what God has joined together, God will keep together if the two continue to look to God. That's what's important about marriage and making it last and making it work. That God is involved and God is in the center because He is the one who invented it. I want to thank you for joining us here for our midweek time, for our 36th week out of these 52 weeks. We'll keep getting near the end and closer. I hope you're enjoying this book as well. Stay safe and God bless.